Tonight on Open Line, we are talking about human trafficking and how to stop it. And we invite you to be part of the conversation. 615-737-PLUS is the number to call. Margie Quin is my expert tonight, CEO of End Slavery Tennessee. Margie, again, thank you for being with us. We've been talking about this for many years now, and you have served as a great expert for us on the news side here on Open Line. And when we've talked before, we've mentioned a report card that Tennessee gets, all the states get, and it kind of tracks how the state is doing, and we were doing really well, but the recent report card is not good. We came in with a D. Give us some insight of what's happening here.
Yeah, let me kind of shuffle back and give you just a little bit of history. Shared Hope International is a great nonprofit working on both the domestic and international side. And about a decade ago, they looked around at the states and they saw a lot of gaps in state laws, state legal framework to address trafficking. There were a number of states that didn't even have a human trafficking law on their books. In the last segment, I just talked about the fact that Tennessee's law came on board in 2007. And so they created this framework, this rubric, this roadmap, if you will, and gave it all to states, gave it all to the attorneys general in every state. And they released a report card in 2011. And that report card had Tennessee at a C grade, which doesn't sound great either, but no state got an A, and I think there were only 7 states that were ahead of us that year. And so we worked really hard in our state to both improve our response as well as the legal framework from which we can respond to trafficking. And so we worked, and by 2014, 2015, we were the A grade. We were the #1 state in the nation. And that felt great. It's great to be #1 in the nation, and it's great to lead in this particular area. One of the first things we did in the state in 2011, for instance, was decriminalize prostitution for minors, which means we could no longer and would no longer arrest children for the crime of prostitution, a crime they really can't legally engage in to begin with. And so we started to clear up a lot of kind of confusion in the code, if you will. And so that was great, and we celebrated being #1 in the nation. So fast forward to 2020, and Shared Hope said, we're going to redo the rubric. We've learned a lot in the last decade working on trafficking. The states have learned a lot working on trafficking. We know what's working and what's not working. So they kind of threw out all the grades, and they said, we're going to start again at 0. And we're going to reframe and retool the rubric to really focus on victim services. I think it's pretty easy to increase penalties for individuals who are trafficking, especially with children. But codifying victim services and codifying the process by which victims access services is a little more nuanced. It's sort of the fine print, if you will. And so they released the grades last week at the Shared Hope conference, and while the D grade doesn't sound great, and it kind of made me a little nauseous for a little bit, especially because we had worked so hard, to get to that #1 spot. We are still a top tier state. We're still in tier 1 as compared to other states, but we got a little bit of work to do to get back to that number one ranking. And so
where are we falling short? Where are the deficits in Tennessee?
Yeah, so there are 6 key areas that they're looking at. They're looking at criminal provisions, but we got most of the points we can get on criminal provisions. They're looking at continuum of care, and that is, say, once a person turns 18, is there a continuum of care for that person? Because we see a lot of folks kind of falling off the radar. Maybe you're a trafficking victim at 16 or 17, but you age out of services at 18, or you're a trafficking victim at 17 years and 10 months. I used to see that quite a bit. Nothing magic happens on your 18th birthday, but a lot of the continuum of care stops, even though we know, and I think it's pretty well accepted, that the brain science says that your brain isn't fully formed until you're about 25. And so we're looking at establishing a continuum of care for those juveniles who've been trafficked continuing that through potentially their 25th birthday and giving them access to services. We're looking for at tools for a victim-centered criminal justice response. And so putting mechanisms and putting things in place in, say, the juvenile courts. One idea is, and we've been doing this in a pilot project with Epic Girl, a great program operating out of the Davidson County Juvenile Court, where we're screening all female juveniles that are coming into the court for status offenses. So things like runaway and truancy and sort of the low-level stuff. But we probably need to be screening all juveniles who are coming through the juvenile court for status offenses and delinquent offenses in hopes of that early identification. The earlier we can identify a victim and put them on a road to services and restoration, obviously the better. And so early identification of victims is key here. So that would be codifying tools for sort of a victim-centered approach to criminal justice and that response. And that kind of bleeds over into the identification and response to victims. That's the fourth key area. We've made training for teachers mandatory. We made training for law enforcement mandatory, but we didn't make it reoccurring. And so we probably need to make training for law enforcement reoccurring. We need to put in place some systems to identify victims kind of as early as we possibly can in the system. We need to have access to justice for trafficking survivors. So that means expungement for crimes that may have been committed at the same time of their trafficking offense. It's very unlikely that a trafficking victim is only going to commit the crime of, say, like prostitution. We see a lot of ancillary crimes like theft, drug possession, simple assault, shoplifting, those sorts of things. So we need to have access to justice for those survivors and create a system where they can expunge those laws that occurred during their trafficking period. And then, of course, the last one, the sixth one, is prevention and training. And so we've got to continue to increase training, continue to increase prevention work across the state so that we kind of cut the spigot off of both survivors as well as continue to do prevention training to populations who would buy, to buyers. The TBI, when I was there, we kept a lot of data on like who are these men that are buying, either adults or buying children. And if we could identify a sort of target population, could we begin prevention efforts, sort of towards that population? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, buyers tend to be sort of everybody, every age group, every socioeconomic, every race, every culture. It's very, very wide. And so the more education that we do, more advocacy work in the public, I think that we're going to say that's also prevention.
That makes sense. And I'm glad you said that about the buyers, because I was going to ask you, who is the typical buyer? And you answered that saying there is really not a typical buyer.
Everybody.
I think when people, maybe some people, when they think about human trafficking, they want it to be very black and white. And I imagine a bit of that same answer is true about a victim, although it sounds like from what I've read, victims are often, when it comes to human trafficking and exploitation sexually, they're young girls who have perhaps been runaways or in the foster care system or in the criminal system already. It makes them vulnerable.
Yes. So the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the data up on their website right now suggests that about 1 in 6 trafficking victims are in foster care or have had episodes in foster care. We know a lot of the survivors that we serve were either in foster care, had involvement in the child welfare system, or were living with extended relatives because parents could not take care of them. A lot of trauma in early childhood. If you listen to our podcast, In Slavery, Tennessee has a podcast called Someone Like Me, and you will hear the survivors that have come through our program. It's a great way to animate their voice without exploiting them and without identifying them to the public. And so if you want to hear a survivor speak about their experiences, their early childhood experiences, some of them talk about their path to trafficking, I would urge folks to download some of the episodes on that podcast and hear from a survivor. I think it's important that we listen to survivors and hear what they're telling us and what they're saying, and that's another big reason for retooling this rubric from Shared Hope. Last week at the Shared Hope conference, there were, I think, as many survivors as have ever been at that conference, about 70.
Oh, wow.
And it's incredible to see survivors thriving and becoming leaders in the effort to eradicate human trafficking.
You know, it is kind of a double-edged sword. Often we don't see survivors, we don't identify survivors because of the harm that it can do, the additional harm, but it also makes the crime still a hidden crime.
Yes. Yeah, I think so, and it can be very exploitive to put a survivor up and have them tell their story.
Yeah.
Because obviously that's going to create additional trauma. And many sexual assault survivors, many trafficking survivors, because a trafficking survivor is a sexual assault survivor, a rape survivor, and so many of these women have children. They don't want to be, they don't, want their image and their name and their story out there. I think that's a very personal choice. And so at End Slavery Tennessee, we want to educate the public about trafficking, and we want to do it with a survivor's voice. In other words, we want to do it with their lens. We don't want to speak for them, but being able to do that without exploitation is tricky. And so the podcast turned out to be a great way, I think, to animate their voice. And the survivors that have participated in it, I think, have felt really good about what they said and what their message was. And it's been a great educational tool for us.
It does humanize it for sure. Tell us one more time, Margie, what the name of that is.
The podcast is called Someone Like Me. And if you remember back when I was running the sting operations for TBI, every sting operation we codenamed Someone Like Me. And if you will listen to season 1, episode 7, you will hear me and the survivor talking, and you'll hear how that name came about. It's a pretty special story.
Oh, I'm going to do it. I love listening to podcasts on my way to work and on my way home, so I will download it tonight, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of other viewers who do it as well. Okay, we have to take another quick break. We'll be right back after this.